Mr. Danny O'Malley has spent a lifetime around the retail grocery business. He began learning about customer service from the master, his late father, Joe O'Malley. At the age of 8, when Joe owned a small grocery store in Broad Ripple that actually failed, later he worked part-time for his dad at Preston's at 71st and Keystone, and starting in 1966 at O'Malley's. Danny left a 6-year career as a junior high and high school English teacher in 1975 to join the family business at O'Malley's full-time. Joe was 55 years old then, and he was looking to slow down a bit, so Danny became involved in many aspects of the business and gradually learned everything that he had ever learned in customer service was woven into it. From handling complaints to writing ads designed to explain how O'Malley's differed from the big boys, and service and how to motivate employees to give that customer service was always Danny's clarion call. He became the president of O'Malley's from 1986 through 2006, and the last 5 years as a part of Marsh Supermarkets. He brought all of that to bear when he started his own Indy's Trusted Servant program. He's added keynote speaking to customer service training programs and started his own company. Let's please give Danny a warm Sparks welcome.
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. One of the things I love about what I do now, and I've been doing it since 2007, is that I get to keep my dad's legacy alive. I do customer service training and keynote speaking, and it's all about the culture. And I watched my dad build 2 different cultures. But I have to give you a little bit of a backstory. Joe O'Malley was born in 1920. He was the 3rd oldest of 9 children, so his teenage years were spent during the Depression. When he was 17 years old, he talked a Kroger store manager into a job. And he soon found out that the grocery business was hard. He worked 21 straight hours his first day in 1937 for $2. Now, I wasn't around, but I believe him, okay? And he found out as he worked his way through Kroger, all the way up to store manager, that he loved what he called giving the lady what she wants. All the customers were ladies back then, all of them. But he hated the corporate thing that got in the way of giving the lady what she wanted. So after he got back from the Navy and from 1941 to 1945, as a Kroger store manager, he looked for something a little more local, and he found it in the early 50s with 2 gentlemen who had a few stores here in Indianapolis that they called Stop and Shop. These 2 gentlemen were named Mr. Frankovitz and Mr. Frisch. And he started as a store manager for them. He soon became their general manager, the guy that oversaw the operations of the stores. As they grew to about the same size O'Malley Food Markets was going to grow to in a generation and a half or so later. In 1956 or thereabouts, when I was about 9, these guys sold their stores to a company out of Atlanta, Georgia called Colonial. And I remember Joe coming home and telling my mom, darn it, I feel like I'm working at Kroger again. All these rules and stuff coming from corporate, they don't understand the customers here in Indianapolis and blah, blah, blah. And he found, at that point, a friend of Mr. Frankovitz and Mr. Frisch who was getting ready to retire and sell his little store in Broad Ripple, which was called Roth's Food Market. There were a lot of little tiny stores around back then in the mid-50s. This is my dad's first store. It is now the Vanguard Bar on Guilford Avenue between 62nd and Westfield Boulevard. This store had 5 employees and 1 cash register. The 5 employees were my dad, the meat guy from Stop and Shop, the local chain he worked for, a cashier, a grocery stocker, a produce guy, maybe there's 6 employees, and a 9, 10-year-old kid myself. My favorite part of my job back then was a couple times a week he'd say, that's Mrs. Reed. She just got back from New Orleans and she wants Frank's hot sauce. Think about a grocery store so small it has 1 cash register. He didn't have room for Frank's hot sauce. He would get 87 cents out of the drawer and send me down to the Kroger, a block south that's still there, and say, get 3 jars of it. Bring it back here before she leaves, don't get hit by a car at 62nd Street. This was 1956 and 57, okay? Things haven't changed geographically at 62nd and Guilford much. And I would say, well, what if it's more than 29 cents a bottle? He'd go, it's 29 cents a bottle. He was always right. So, but he lost the store, and here's why. First of all, he didn't have he was only 35 years old when he opened it, and he didn't have a great credit history. So he was on thin ice with the bank. Now, when he bought the store from Mr. Roth, he left the name Roth's on it. And I said, Daddy, why aren't you changing it to O'Malley's? And he said, the customers are used to it being Roth's. I don't want to mess them up any more than with Mr. Roth leaving and me coming in and trying to win them over. So we're leaving it Roth's. My first marketing lesson, okay? At any rate, things went pretty well because he had a built-in customer base. But within a year or so, he and his partner, that was the meat guy from Stop and Shop, decided they were going to open a second store on the west side at what would be 10th and 465 now. My dad went out to run the second store. It didn't have a built-in base. It was a new store. And so that was starting from ground one. It didn't take off like the store in Broad Ripple, and unfortunately his partner, the meat guy from Stop and Shop, couldn't run the rest of the store. Didn't have anybody to send down the street, to get the products that he didn't have room for example. And that store went down and the bank came in and took it all away. Believe it or not, by that time, a couple of years had passed, the company out of Atlanta had run the Stop and Shop chain in the ground so badly that they sold it back to Mr. Frankovitz. Mr. Frankovitz calls Joe O'Malley and says, why don't you come back to work for me and we'll try and save it. Tried that for a couple of years, didn't work. At which point a gentleman named Francis Preston, who was getting ready to open his second store in Indianapolis, that later became, for those of you who are old enough, Preston Safeway. He called my dad and said, I'm going to buy a store at 71st and Keystone, which is where Sullivan's Hardware is now. Much smaller store than Sullivan's. Now I'm 15 years old. I'm a carryout boy flirting with the cashiers, from North Central, by the way. And I'm listening to the customers and the employees and even the Coke and Pepsi guy say, why has this store gone from $6,000 a week a year ago to $50,000 a week now? It's because of the way that man treats people, treats his customers, treats his employees, treats the Coke and Pepsi man. And I'm going, boy, everything my dad has ever told me now is making a whole lot of sense to me. At any rate, that thing became very, very successful for 4 years, and then he's ready to open his first O'Malley's store, and I'm a freshman in college. By the way, this is my daughter. Colleen has an online business called Coco Stein Designs. She does prints, and that's the state of Indiana with all the stores that ever had the O'Malley name on it over the years, including a couple of stores that after we sold to Marsh put our name on it. Well, my dad didn't make the same mistakes with O'Malley's that he'd made before with Roth's and the store on the west side. He didn't have a partner. He didn't open a second. He had built 10 years worth of credit and had a little more money to put into the store. And so he had a better banking relationship. And he didn't open the second store till he was darn good and ready not to mess the first store up by taking the star players out of that store. And so he slowly began to operate and open more stores. This is, I don't know what happened there. Whoop. This is a picture of my dad and myself, the store manager, Grover Peridot Don, Mayor Jane Ryman of Carmel, and the builder of our 5th through 8th stores, the late Dave Freiberger, at the ribbon cutting for the 6th store in 1982 at 126th and Gray, which closed last year and was the last store with our name on it. My dad had taught me, through taking me to Butler games and Indians games, because those were the only teams we had when I was a little kid, with sports, never, ever, 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 ever give up. And I had seen him never, ever, 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 ever give up when he darn near lost his house, losing that first store, and came back 10 years later. This, and there's a poster back there that was our 30th anniversary celebration. There's a lot of good Indianapolis history on there. This is the 30th anniversary of the store that opened on College Avenue in 1966. This is a picture of my dad just 7 months before he passed away at the age of 75 in 1976. He's in the middle. On his left is his first employee who worked for him at Preston's at 71st and Keystone, lived at Emerson and 70, and came to my dad and said, I don't care how far I have to drive to work for you, I want to come up and work for you at that first store. Man, that's culture. And his very first customer, I should have brought the first $2 that this customer sent with my dad, that's Nancy McNevin. And that's the first store a few years after it opened. And you got to stop and look at the poster and see that we only had 4 TV stations in Indianapolis when Joe O'Malley opened his first store. So, Joe taught me to never, ever, ever give up. He taught me about culture. And by the way, almost had it. Well, I went too far. Chris wanted me to say this. Go X basketball.
Don't delay. Get your ticket for the next Sparks event today.